we're witnessing one long, uninterrupted reality TV show. Whatever President Trump does is designed for optics. The meeting in Alaska had very little substance to it. And I don't think he was terribly concerned about the substance. He simply wanted to be seen as changing the climate, at least in broad terms, with Russia. He wanted to be photographed with President Putin surrounded by his F-22s or whatever the aircraft were that were present at the time. And of course, you had the B-2 bomber that overflew everything. This is all vintage Trump. He's very theatrical. He knows how to stage things. But the problem is that meetings on the spur of the moment, which is really what this was, mean there's no systematic preparation that usually takes months. Americans were used in the 1970s and 80s to summits between the Soviet Union and the United States, for instance, after many, many months of very hard work and preparation, detailed preparation for the meeting, such that the leaders who were present, Gorbachev and Reagan, for instance, were no longer debating over the substance of anything. They were talking about the impact and why they thought it made sense. And when they spoke publicly, one had the impression that both had thoroughly digested the material and were reliably supporting it. I don't see any of that with President Trump. So I think the Alaska meeting was a feel-good moment and not much more. And so when people say, well, where are we on the peace front and what kinds of agreements are in the offing, I tell them, look, I don't see any. There are no such agreements. Again, there has never been a strategy enunciated by President Trump and the administration. Frankly, whatever's written on paper doesn't matter because President Trump is impulse driven. So at the end of the day, I just think we're where we were months ago. There's no resolution in sight. And you got to be very careful of these claims. I could end this war in 24 hours. You know, how well did that go down? That's a lot of nonsense. But if you know nothing about Ukraine, know nothing about Eastern Europe, nothing about Russia, and you view yourself as a brilliant deal maker, this is sort of another exercise in selling the used car. And I don't think that works. And so while he may have meant well, and I'm perfectly willing to accept that possibility, nothing of substance came out of it.
And I think you could probably just carry that on through right to Washington, D.C. A week ago on Monday when he had Zelensky and then the European leaders all paraded across the Oval Office. And again, I think that they reiterated where they were weeks, if not months before that. I don't see any change in them either. Do you?
No, not yet. We can come back to that. I do want to make a comment, though, about this particular photograph because General Kellogg apparently has endeared himself to the Russians quite a bit. He apparently has been using the same cell phone and cell phone number, though encrypted over and over and over again for months, maybe years. And as a result, the Russians were able to follow all of his activities whenever he visited Chazov Yar, Chernigov, any of these places. And it is being used for targeting. So that many of the targeted locations that I just mentioned that he's visited have been utterly and completely destroyed, along with whatever military personnel were present, including NATO and including U.S. So he's been a real boon to Russian intelligence.
Wow, did not know that.
Well, I don't think most people do. Excuse me. I was not aware of it either until somebody in the intelligence community pointed it out to me. So it's tragic, but I'm afraid it's true.
And now let's continue on back because the issue is not just what Trump may or may not say. I think that's actually a very interesting observation you made about a ongoing reality TV show because that certainly matches what we've seen. I hadn't thought of it in those terms, but wow, that's pretty accurate. Unfortunately, it's not just him, or at least there's other actors on here. This is former Secretary of State, former CIA Director Mike Pompeo on Fox News having a banter about the part of the claim that that Trump got Russia to agree that they would take back the Donbass area, that Ukraine would evacuate it and hand that back over. And Pompeo basically just mocks that and laughs at the idea. It says it's just posturing.
even to suggest for a moment that they would get all of the Donbass, which is a region that they've been fighting to control wholly for a long time, have been failing to do so, and they just want it for free, want it for nothing, before they've given away anything major. Is that something that can be dismissed pretty readily?
Yes, David, I think it could be dismissed quite readily. In fact, think about this. The Russians have lost somewhere between 200 and 250,000 soldiers. That's dead. That's not casualties. Casualties are multiples of that. In a decade plus of fighting, the United States lost 50,000 soldiers. I mean, the staggering death toll is very real. Putin knows that. And so when he makes this claim that someone's going to give him some real estate that has been fought over like this, I think he knows that's not right. In the end, President Zelensky is going to have to likely accept that some of the real estate that the Russians have taken, he's not going to be able to reclaim immediately. He won't be forced to recognize it. I think there's a deal in there that can be reached that is fair and just and provides sustainable, pick a number, 25 years of peace if we get the security guarantee piece of this right.
All we have to do is get Russia to agree to give in on almost all of their positions from a position of strength. What do you say to that?
Well, remember, this is the same man who pointed out that when he was the head of the CIA, it was his job to lie. And I think he's done an excellent job of it. He continues to lie about all of this business in Ukraine. He's adopted this utterly fictitious narrative that everything started with Putin's decision some morning to wake up and decide to invade Ukraine. It's all nonsense. I wouldn't pay much attention to anything that Pompeo says. I would just dismiss it out of hand. It's unworthy of serious discussion. And by the way, I think President Trump would probably say that privately as well.
And it's unfortunate, though, because you certainly know that and have good reason to making that statement. But most people watching television, they don't know that. They think, wow, former CIA director, former Secretary of State, he must carry a lot of weight. He certainly is still friendly in terms with President Trump. But one wonders what the purpose then of having him say stuff like that. And by the way, this was in a certain sense mirrored by Emmanuel Macron about a week or so ago when he was mocking the Russian side, because you saw the anchor there said, well, it's ridiculous to think that Russia, who couldn't take the Donbass in all these 3.5 years, they're just going to be giving it to them. Macron kind of echoed that and says, well, look, in the last, I think it's since November 2022, they said Russia's only captured an additional 1% of territory, so they really aren't that capable. So what do you say to those kind of comments?
Well, we've been down this road before. Putin framed this as a special military operation. He did not frame it as an all-out war. But he discovered after the first several months, certainly after the first 6 months of action, that he was not really facing Ukraine. He was facing the United States and the West, primarily U.S. military power and all of its enormously valuable capabilities from seabed to space. When that was finally discovered and understood, but it wasn't understood at the beginning, because I think President Putin, who's always been very favorable in his thinking about the West, had to come to the conclusion that this was a completely malicious action on the part of the United States to destroy Russia. When that happened, everything began to change. I just think that Macron is another globalist. The globalists in London, Paris, and Berlin are all clinging desperately to power right now. Their populations almost universally loathe Macron, Starmer, and Merz. But the oppressive apparatus that they control, the media that they control, the governmental institutions, the intelligence services are working overtime day and night to suppress any possible emergence of a viable opponent. And that's what's happened to the Alternative for Germany. It's happened in France. It's happening in England especially, but also Scotland and Wales to a lesser extent. And the sad part is that it's hopeless because the war is being won by the Russians. Now, this business of territory, President Putin did not set out on this operation to capture territory, never did. We're the ones that keep obsessing over territory. What he set out to do was to utterly and completely annihilate the Ukrainian threat. That Ukrainian threat was manifested by its paramilitary and armed forces. They are just about gone. Let's face it, they've been killed in great numbers. We now have all sorts of information saying anywhere from 1.7 to 1.8 million Ukrainians have been killed on this eastern Ukrainian battlefield. And that's really been the objective, to destroy that entity. The Russians are now operating on the other side of the river. And a lot of people don't realize this, on the outskirts of Odessa. You've got special operations forces there directing strikes and eliminating the Odessa base of operation for the regime. I think you're going to see more of that in the future. But again, if you go back to historical experience and the origins of what we call Ukraine and New Russia that was created under Catherine the Great, it goes back to the capture of Crimea and then the settlement of the areas along the Black Sea out to the Romanian border and all the way up along the Dnieper River. Those things are real, and Putin has made it very clear that that portion, which is settled by Russians, populated by Russians, where the Russians speak, read, and write their language and their culture is predominant, those will be protected. They will be kept. They will not be given up. But the idea that he was ever interested in marching all the way to the Polish border is a lot of nonsense. Now, if no one is willing to sit down and secure an agreement with Moscow that basically turns what's left of Ukraine into a neutral state on the Austrian state treaty model, then I guess the Russians will actually cross in strength and head west, because they don't have any choice. What the Russians don't want to do is refight this war. But again, we've never seen things in that light, because we don't want to. We want to cast Putin as the aggressor. He has to be demonized. He's the latest version of Gaddafi or Saddam Hussein, the usual suspects. It's all nonsense. And unfortunately, when you listen to Pompeo and others, they fall back on that phony narrative. And that narrative is picked up particularly by Fox News, but also by the other mainstream media outlets. And let's face it, our generation, my generation, I'm a so-called boomer, we all watch that stuff. Now, I don't. I mean, occasionally I'll put it on just to see what the other side is saying. But unfortunately, the majority of my age, they still go back to the same poison well to ingest more poison. The rest, 40 and under, they've walked away. They're getting their information and news elsewhere.
Yeah, like the Daniel Davis deep dive. That's why we're on the air right here and having you come in and talk about this. You mentioned in there about that Russia doesn't want to fight this war again. Pompeo said toward the end of that clip right there that if we get the security guarantees part right, he said we might have as much as 25 years of peace before a new conflict breaks out. Well, in looking at what those security guarantees look like, President Trump was asked yesterday from the Oval Office, and he says, well, we really don't know about them, but one thing, it's going to be easy.
Well, you don't know what security guarantee is because we haven't even discussed the specifics of it, and we'll see. Number one, Europe is going to give them significant security guarantees, and they should because they're right there. But we'll be involved from the standpoint of backup. We're going to help them. And I think if we get a deal, and I think we will, but if we get a deal, you're not going to. I don't believe you're going to have much of a problem.
So yeah, it's we don't even know what this was crazy. Yeah. We had the Alaska, we had the Oval Office meeting with Europe, and then now yesterday we're still saying we don't even know what the terms that we're trying to get done are. But it's not going to be hard. I mean, what do you take from that?
Not much. It's more hot air. I mean, if with all the hot air that comes out of the Oval Office these days and Congress, I'm surprised that Washington is still on the planet and hasn't lifted off and been elevated into outer space. I think what we need to do is understand that there are certain people with a keen and justified interest in what happens to Ukraine. If you live in Lithuania, I think the Lithuanians have an interest, although I don't think it's as great as the others. Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, Moldova. Those are the key states that border Ukraine. Now, in the case of Poland and Hungary, and I don't know about Slovakia, they also have some territorial interests given their history. I know that the Hungarians would like to bring in a couple of 100,000 Hungarians that are living inside Ukraine. Got to go all the way back to the Versailles Treaty and then subsequently the tragic outcome of the Second World War, and see that a lot of these people ended up in places they didn't want to be, under governments they didn't want to be subservient to. So they all have an interest in what happens in Ukraine. They're the ones that really need to sit down with the Russians. I would argue the Germans do. The Germans, because they've always played a very, very important role in Central East Europe. They have long-term strategic interests with Russia. They need to sit down. They should be part of that. But as far as the rest of the Europeans are concerned, they don't know anything about the region. They have no background or experience there. They're up to mischief. They're up to malevolent activities. We're back to MI6 moving in to create havoc today in the Balkans, at a place like Croatia, trying to foment conflict with Serbia, or put people in power in any of these Balkan states that are, like their contemporaries in Western Europe, enemies of their own population and countries. This sort of thing needs to stop, but unfortunately it's on autopilot right now. And I don't even think President Trump is aware of just how serious the problem is. But the notion that somehow or another what Macron thinks in Paris or Starmer in London is important to the outcome is nonsense. They're just globalists clinging to power, trying to convince everybody that Russia is this great and powerful threat that can't wait to overrun Europe. That's just not true. It's not been true from the very beginning of this, and it's less true now than at any point in the history of Europe. Everybody except the United States and its globalist friends wants peace. They want peace and prosperity. That's what they want. Now, the good news is that President Trump said something that makes a lot of sense, that we are in a backup mode. That's a good thing. And he ought to repeat that, because these people, they need to come to terms with Russia, not us. We have interests in Russia. We want good relations with them. And I think privately President Trump would say that. The problem is that he cuts off his nose to spite his face on a routine basis by making comments and statements and failing to rein in the CIA and other entities, government entities, and get them on board with a real strategy that is promising in terms of its relevance to peace and prosperity. But I'm glad he said backup. That's where we belong in Europe, not as the first responder, not as the single key player representing everybody else. That's nonsense.